Welcome, everyone. My name is James Green. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative and a professor of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies and History at Brown University. And we're very excited to have our guest speaker today. But before I introduce Fernanda Sposito, I would like to ask Ramon Stern, who is our program administrator of the Brazil Initiative and responsible for all the wonderful events that take place here, to say a few words about our upcoming activities.
So thank you everyone for coming and for being loyal guests of the Brazil Initiative. We have a few events coming up in addition to this one that I just wanted to draw your attention to. Next week, Marlise Matos, who's a political scientist, is going to talk about violence against women in politics, the case of Dilma Rousseff. That'll be Wednesday, October 2nd, another Wednesday, next Wednesday, here at 12. The following week, we have two events after that. On October 9th, which is also a Wednesday at noon, Luiz Inácio Adams, who's a private attorney in Brazil, will talk about challenges to the Brazilian Constitution. Is our democracy in jeopardy? And we'll also have a screening on Thursday, October 10th at 7 p.m. here in Jakowski of the documentary Sem Descanso by Bernardi Attal, which is a film about a young black man in Salvador, Bahia, who was disappeared by police, and his father's search of the whereabouts of his son. We also have Cine Brasil, our annual film festival in the fall, coming up Thursday, October 24th through Saturday, October 26th, in Martino's Auditorium at the Granoff Center. All of this information is up on our website. It is also on the programs that I have here, so if anybody wants any of these programs, they can come to me after the talk. Also, if you want to be on our events list, just email me at Brazil with a Z, Brazil, at brown.edu to ask to be added to our events list so that you can be informed week by week of what is happening. Thank you very much, and I'll let Jim now introduce Fernanda. Thank you very much.
And I just cannot emphasize how important Ramon is for everything that runs smoothly. Everything that's a mistake is my fault, and everything that runs smoothly is Ramon's. Those of you who followed the United Nations General Assembly speeches yesterday saw that the first person to speak was President Jair Bolsonaro, who denied that there was any serious burning of the Amazon, and also insisted that the policies of the government was to keep indigenous peoples in savage state, and he really wanted to integrate them into Brazilian society and open the Amazon riches to the exploitation for the benefit of all. It was a really interestingly and widely criticized speech in Brazil by the center-right, to say nothing of others of the left who are criticizing him at this point. So I think one of the wonderful things about this event and many activities we've been organizing about indigenous peoples in the Amazon in Brazil is to really understand the history of the story behind the ways in which the Portuguese were involved in the colonization and the conquest and of the indigenous people and their resistance. And so today I have tremendous honor to introduce Fernanda Sposito, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Federal University of São Paulo and is currently a research fellow at the John Carter Brown Library. She received her doctorate in social history at the University of São Paulo and has published her dissertation as the book Nem Cidadãos, Nem Brasileiros Indígenas na Formação do Estado Nacional Brasileiro e Conflitos na Província de São Paulo, Neither Citizens Nor Brazilians, Indigenous People in the Formation of the Brazilian Nation State and Conflicts in the Province of São Paulo, 1822 to 1845. And her current research looks at the Portuguese and Spanish indigenous policies between the 16th and 18th century. With much pleasure, we welcome Fernanda, please. We understand that some people have to leave early because they have other commitments, and I and a couple of other people in this room have to slip out to a meeting. So it's not because we didn't adore her presentation today.
Okay. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm trying to speak in English. I prepared a speech, and the problem some people lost in my translation, and in the end, it's possible to translate some parts. It's not possible to understand. I really so pleased and so honored to be here. For me, it's very important. I have been following the activities of Watts Institute and Brazil Initiative since Brazil. I know the importance these movements, these researches headed here, and the role of Professor James Green in the movements between Brazil and the US. For example, Historiadores pela Democracia, Historians for Democracy. The movement of historians in Brazil in the context of the coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016. And today, for example, the movement Network for Democracy, headed by Professor James Green. And thanks for Professor James Green and Ramon Stern for inviting me and be here. As Professor Green said, always about politics today, and in the past, my speech is about the colonization, about many long time ago. But today, yesterday, in fact, Jair Bolsonaro, as James Green said, was in New York and talking, following by indigenous leadership, said his government protect the indigenous and all this stuff. It's very complicated. And before I start my research, I would like to say about the problem, about the politics in Brazil today. For example, be here today is almost a miracle in this day, because the problem in a governor, when the research, the university, the knowledge is enemies of state, not the goals of the state, is very complicated. And I'm here sponsored by a public foundation, FAPESP, São Paulo Research Foundation. And I don't know about the future of Brazilian researchers here in US or in other part of the world. So, I would like to do an invitation to everyone to go to the 16th and 19th centuries and listen some indigenous voices, some impressions about the settlers and about the indigenous themselves of the colonization process. The research of all, in general, not the specific that I will show here, is about the construction of the colonial politics for indigenous people and Hispanic and Portuguese America. My hypothesis is to understand the colonial politics. To understand this point, we should understand the indigenous politics. It's very important to pay attention to these issues, especially in history of Brazil. We have a tradition that pay attention more specific about black population, black people, and slavery of African, not specific about indigenous. For understand this point, we have noted there wouldn't have been colonization without negotiation. when I said negotiation, I mean not only submission, but the mediations, the deals between indigenous leaderships and colonial authorities in the name of the crowns. Obviously, I speak about the violence, the destruction of the indigenous people, but it's necessary to be more activity in this way. It's necessary to speak more about this case. Otherwise, the history ends in this point. Violence, death, and nothing else. Other thing is important to say is the focus on Portugal and Spain on the same time is not a comparative perspective. My point is a connect histories, because both were Catholic crowns and subordinate to the Catholic Church, especially with the royal patronage, translate of real patronato, padroado régio in Portuguese, or real patronato de Índios in Spanish. For example, to illustrate some kind of visions about the conquest, I said about the violence. The most important first chronicle about this process was Bartolomeu de las Casas. All these books as extremely bloody, extremely sad, extremely complicated situations. Unfortunately, there was, but his presence is all in our studies and in our lives. There is a historian, Brazilian historian, João Manuel Monteiro. He says about the importance of us as historians to do more than the Extinction Chronicle, as Bartolomeu had been done 4 centuries ago. My point, as I said, is to do more than, and these impressions about all the scenes of the conquerors arrive and the negotiation. For example, this person as a king, described many times as king or leader or principal. And some European impressions about this process. A very famous phrase about indigenous leaderships is no law, no king, no faith. Sem fé, sem rei, sem lei, sem rei, sem fé. But this description is very usual about many heretic people in the modern age, in this process of the colonization. For example, the inhabitants of São Paulo, the captains of São Vicente in the American Portuguese, as described as no law, no king, no faith, too, because they captured indigenous free as slaves. And this discretion is was used for the inhabitants of São Paulo too in the beginning of the colonization. Not for to indigenous people, but this phrase is very common associated with the indigenous. Who watched the speech in the last week of Estevam Fernandes about the sexuality of the indigenous? Can remember about the sodomites, and this describes is very common as savages, perverts, polygamous, sodomites, cannibals, animals. So, on one hand, the idea of the savagery and inferiority, but on the other hand, the importance of this kind of leaderships, named as kings, leaders, chiefs, masters, even in Spanish or Portuguese way, reis, chefes, senhores, caciques, principais. A lot of documents prove the need to recognize the authority of these leaderships for colonization begin. What I mean with this idea is not only the violence, only the devastation. It's necessary to mediation, it's necessary negotiation, because wars and treaties, because it's necessary workforce, it's necessary labor to building the colonization. And in this span, they have repartimentos, a kind of sharings, the wealth between the conquerors. Repartimentos was in action since Christopher Columbus arrived in America. He had the power to sharing the lands and the people. The point is, without workers, usually the most of the case enslaved, lands didn't exist, because the lands by itself is a sink. It's necessary someone to produce, to find gold, or produce food and other things. The transportation, all the things necessary to conquer. And the story of the colonization of America is the stories about the attempts by crowns, Portuguese and Spanish crowns, to control the access of this kind of wealth. And this point, the control of indigenous, is the first battlefield between the conquerors and among the conquerors and the crowns. There were encomendas too, is a other kind of politics, Spanish politics, is specific grace, a royal grace, gave for a person or a religious institution by the king. In the perspective of the indigenous, this kind of negotiation, this kind of submission of by the the power of a king of Spain, is a kind of exchange of goods for protection. Protection against who? Against the all conquerors. I will show excerpts of documents. Is possible to understand better my point. And in Portugal, I made a translation about the Statute of Tomé de Souza, the first governor of Brazil, o Regimento de Tomé de Souza. This first official document about the colonization said about the indigenous allies. They were peaceful people and offered themselves to help expel the enemies from the land, defend and occupy it. The idea, the double idea of protection and attack, the same, the both ways in the same alley. And I found in my research a document was in Antônio Vieira, priest Antônio Vieira, very famous Jesuit, Portuguese Jesuit. And Vieira showed a document as would be the treaty with the indigenous authorities. Let's follow in the document. Principle of the idea in Portuguese is fulano. I don't know how to translate fulano. I tried to put it this way. I don't know if it's correct form. Principle of succession in my name and all my vessels and descendants' name, promise to God and the King of Portugal the faith in Jesus Christ our Lord, and to be, as well as I am from today on, vassal of your Majesty, and to have eternal peace with the Portuguese, being a friend to all their friends. This part is very important. Be friend to all their friends and an enemy of all their enemies. Oblige myself to keep this way forever. It's a kind of negotiation. We don't have the documents, many documents. We have, after in the 17th centuries in Brazil, we have this kind of the documents, but in the beginning of the colonization, not. And I will try to show you, obviously is a try, the indigenous way to realize, to note this process. And I choose three scenes, three different kind of documents to show these ways. For example, the first scene, and I have some pictures, but obviously is not real. Is a European imagination about the rituals, the way of indigenous. But Tibiriçá, chief of Tupiniquins in São Paulo, in a simple way, I said Tibiriçá is responsible to São Paulo begin in that place, because he was very powerful. He had many people below his power, and he became Christian, and he was baptized, and commanded many wars against his indigenous animals. But these animals, this point is very important, were firstly his animals, not only animals of the Portugal and the Portuguese. As cannibal, Tibiriçá usually participated in many rituals with dance, with drink, and in a certain point, the principal clubbed on the hand with a big wood, and the animal died, and after they prepare the body for the ritual of cannibalism. But in that moment, Tibiriçá was a Christian, baptized. It is not possible to do this kind of things. Just wars, not cannibalism. But in a moment when indigenous animal give away and try to do a treaty with Portuguese, and Tibiriçá didn't accept this and clubbed his head, the head of the animal, with a big wood, a big piece of wood. This point, the continuance of the way, the indigenous way, otherwise the control. This is Hans Staden pictures, not of Hans Staden, but in his book, about the practice of cannibalism, and this moment specific with the big wood in the head of the animal that I described. Obviously, this is not real. This is a recreation. It's a fantasy about the reality. And this other representation about the leaderships of Tupinambás is the same way that Tibiriçá as Tupiniquim. It's very similar, the culture. And the other parts of America, Latin America, but in the Strait of Magellan, in the beginning of the 17th century, occurred a meeting with many principals, named in this document as caciques, with the Jesuits to decide if the principal and all them people accept or not the conversion. They heard Jesuits speak a lot of stuff about the conversion, the benefits about that, and they said they talked with each other, and after said to the Jesuits, if we accept the conversion, we would be able to drink or have many wives. It's not so convenient for us. Our animals would see us like weak or like women, and we don't like that. We don't have deal, okay? And the idea that the conversion, the alliance with the Spanish is not good for them. And I pick up many images. So one image like that is about one talk. Not it's possible to talk the complete idea in this representation, but we have here two main characters, Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru, and Atahualpa, he named Ataliba, in the death of Atahualpa. The importance of this picture is noted the process to destroy, not only physically, but symbolic, in the symbolic way, the power of the indigenous kings. And the other representation, the wonderful image from JCB, is amazing. Obviously, also I need to speak more about this, but I don't have time, and my study is not specifically about the pictures. But I guess the pictures help us to understand the point that I want to show. These orejones with two men, orejones because the big earring, and these men were Spanish. And the importance of the reverence, the recognizing of this leadership. And this is very interesting. I ask you a license to read the big excerpt, but it's very interesting to note a kind of perspective indigenous in this case. This occurred in the beginning of the colonization. Francisco Lopes de Gomarra, in Historia General de Indias, described this process when a conqueror tried to convince the chief to accept the conquest. And the conqueror gave them, the indigenous people, a long sermon about their conversion to the faith and baptisms based on the only God who created heaven and earth and mankind. He after said that the Father sent of Rome, Vicar of Jesus Christ in the whole circle of the earth, with all the absolute control of the souls and the religion, gave these lands to the Castilla king, your lord, and we would come to take these lands. But he would throw them out if they decide to be Christian and vassals of so powerful prince, paying him a tax of gold per year. They said, the leadership said, smiling, that looked good idea. There is only one God. It's a good idea, it's okay. But they didn't want to fight nor to give up on their religion, and that the Saint Father must have been very sincere with others, or a rebel, because he gave away that didn't belong to him, the Pope, the God, or whatever. And the king of Spain, was a poor person because he begged, besides being impertinent because he treated those he didn't know. If the conqueror and the king, wherever, if he took their lands, they would put this head on a pike together with their other animals, and they pointed to that place. There were the head of the animals. So this is this excerpts in Francisco Lopes de Gomarra and in the Strait of Magellan. Here is in Caribbean. In the beginning of the colonization, here in the Strait of Magellan, 100 after, and here in the same period that the negotiation in the Caribbean. My point is show this indigenous voice, as I said in the beginning of my speech, and try to realize, to understand this kind of things. It's all. Thank you so much for attention. And after we have the space for asks for me. Thank you.
So, people have any questions they'd like to ask? Add to the debate? Perhaps you could explain a little bit more about the strategy of negotiation as a successful or an unsuccessful strategy. So if this is a way of resistance or survival by indigenous people, to what extent does negotiation actually help effectively the survival of indigenous people?
Yeah, this process is very complex. I had a point with this kind of things because there are historians in Brazil that believe that negotiations and the accept, as for example Tibiriçá and the other leaderships in Rio de Janeiro, for example, is the best example of the indigenous resistance, because they continue as indigenous, but indigenous inside the colonization, and the other leaderships, other people that didn't accept the colonization, stayed in continuous fight wars, and the most of part of these people died. For example, in the northeast of Brazil, there is a discussion very complex about this kind of thing. For example, João Pacheco de Oliveira showed the reinvention of the indigenous in this 20th century, when a part of the Brazil, when we believe that there exist indigenous anymore, but they exist as a indigenous mixture and a reinvention of their identities. What's the term that João Pacheco used? Ethnogenes, yeah. The reinvention of this kind of... It's very complicated, Jim. Talk about what is successful or what is not successful. The successful is is the indigenous that resist with threats or with wars? I don't know the answer. And about the indigenous of the Rio de Janeiro, Maria Regina Celestino de Almeida tried to show this process to accept the conditions of the colonization is a way to survive. I don't know. I have doubts about it. I have been made the discussions with my colleagues in Congress in Brazil and try to answer to answer this question, and it's not a simple answer. I don't know if I'm clear.
No other questions? If not, thank you so much.